Gentlemen, I call this meeting to order. I see a quorum. It's our great honor today to welcome to the committee there's the Parliament's Auditor General. She has been to many committees and therefore needs no introduction. I'll therefore ask the Auditor General to make her opening statement, and then we'll move to questions from members. Thank you, Ms. Fraser.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We thank you for this opportunity to meet with the committee to discuss Chapter 3 of our 2010 Spring Report, Rehabilitating the Parliament Buildings. I'm accompanied today by Sylvain Ricard, Assistant Auditor General, who was responsible for this audit. On ne saurait trop insister sur l'importance des édifices.
The importance of the buildings on the Hill cannot be overstated. The Parliament buildings are the centerpiece of our national political life. The site, the architectural style, and the building layout were designed to convey an image of ceremony and order. With time, the buildings and the grounds have become a symbol of Canada's parliamentary democracy and the federal government. The Parliament buildings have been in need of major repairs and upgrading for over 2 decades. Through its assessment of building conditions, Public Works has identified serious risks that could affect the continued operations of Parliament. The heritage character of some buildings is also threatened. Furthermore, the Senate and the House of Commons have indicated that their current and future needs cannot be met by the buildings in their present state.
Rehabilitation work while the buildings continue to deteriorate. We found that decision-making and accountability are fragmented. We also found that the current arrangements do not allow for reaching consensus on priorities and committing resources to implement long-term plans. These weaknesses, which cannot and should not be attributed to any organization alone, result in delays in making decisions and implementing projects and contribute to increasing project costs and risks. We have reported similar findings in audits we carried out in 1992 and in 1998. We believe that unless governance is fixed, only limited progress will be made on the rehabilitation of the Parliament buildings. 3 critical issues need to be dealt with: accountability relationships, long-term planning to rehabilitate buildings and meet the requirements of their main users, and finally, stable and long-term funding to complete planned work. La vocation fondamentale de ces édifices.
The ultimate purpose of these buildings is to support Parliament's unique operations. In our view, the Parliament buildings are a special purpose space, and the control and responsibility for these buildings need to rest with Parliament. We have recommended that the Minister of Public Works and Government Services, in cooperation with the principal players, should develop and propose mechanisms to ensure that the responsibility and accountability for the Parliament buildings rest with the Senate and the House of Commons. At the time of the audit, the Department acknowledged the recommendation and undertook within its mandate and authorities to work with other stakeholders to strengthen governance. Should the committee want an update on their progress, it may wish to invite officials from the department.
It's also been looking at contracting related to work on the precinct. I would just like to point out that our audit, which was completed in October of 2009, did not look at contracting activities. In conclusion, Mr. Chair, the long-standing governance problem, which we and others have raised over many years, has to be resolved. This concludes, Mr. Chair, my opening remarks, and we would be pleased to answer any questions that committee members may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fraser. Just before I open up the round of questioning, this is largely a non-partisan meeting, and I just wanted to canvass colleagues. I did canvass 2 colleagues, one said yes, one said no, about reducing the initial 8-minute round to a 5-minute round so that more colleagues can participate in the conversation. If you're in favor of that, I don't want to get into a long conversation. If there isn't any unanimity on that point, then no. No? Okay. Then our usual round, and the first 8 minutes goes to the Liberal Party, which is Mr. Reagan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here, Ms. Fraser. It's always a pleasure to have you come before the committee, and I must say that I find it even more pleasant now that I'm in opposition. I want to reiterate some of what you said. In fact, I'm going to quote from page 11 of your report. You said, "We found that the governance framework in place is inadequate to guide the rehabilitation of the Parliament buildings. In particular, we found that decision-making and accountability are fragmented, and there is a lack of consensus on priorities. Further, there is no funding commitment to implement long-term plans. These gaps in governance contribute to the delays in addressing the continuing deterioration of the Parliament buildings." And it's worrisome because what this seems to suggest is that these buildings may be deteriorating faster than the ever so slow work to repair them is occurring. Can you tell us if there's been any meaningful progress since you tabled your audit?
Chair, we have not done any follow-up work per se. We are, of course, aware that members have been moved from the West Block and that work will begin, I presume, imminently or has begun on the West Block, but we have not done any follow-up, so I think that's a question that the department would be best placed to answer.
Do you think that there is a need for a single body or agency to take over the responsibility, to take over a strong oversight role for this kind of work in the Parliament buildings?
Chair, it was probably pretty easy for us to recommend that Parliament assume control of the buildings. As they say, the devil is in the details, and how this would actually be structured, I think, is up to Parliament and government to determine. There has been work done in the past looking at different models, and we recommended to the department and the minister that they come forward with proposals. To my knowledge, that has not been done yet, but again, that would be something to ask the department where they are at, what discussions have been held with the parliamentary partners, and is there a common agreement on a model that would work. But clearly, we believe that the responsibility has to be given back to Parliament.
So you'd say, I guess, that a single oversight body led by Parliament would be a better role than leaving this with Public Works and Government Services?
Yeah, at the current time, Public Works and Government Services Canada is the custodian of the building. The two houses, the two houses of Parliament will express their needs to Public Works, but then Public Works has to go and try and negotiate the funding. Parliament is not involved in those discussions. There's often conflicting priorities, as we mentioned, between Parliament and the government. And there are too many sort of intermediary steps, and under government policy, if there is sort of special usage or special purpose buildings, they generally will belong with the agency or department that is using those buildings. And clearly the Parliament buildings, I think we can all agree, are special purpose. So Parliament needs to be much more involved, responsible, accountable for the rehabilitation of the Parliament buildings and their ongoing maintenance.
In your report, you set out the context for your report, and you talk about how the present system functions and the history of the Parliament buildings a little bit. And you mentioned the Parliamentary Precinct Oversight Advisory Committee. What was your reaction when you learned that that committee could not even secure a meeting with the minister to outline their concerns about this process?
I really can't comment on that, Chair. We looked at the role that committee plays. We know that there have been meetings and recommendations by that committee, but beyond that, I have no comment to make. Okay. Well, should we be concerned that the advisory committee could not even get a meeting with the minister to present their advice to her? Again, I'm reluctant to comment on that. Well, I think we should. But, now, I understand that the West Block work is expected to cost just over $750 million by the time it's finished in about 8 years from now, if it is, we hope, in 8 years and not longer. And it's reportedly the largest of the $5 billion in renovation projects that are planned. But unfortunately, in the last year, it's been linked to illegal lobbying, biker gang ties, ministerial incompetence, unfinished work, companies going bankrupt, and suspicious fundraising dinners. From your experience with this file, can you say that it's currently on budget and on time? We have not looked at the project for over a year. I would say the long history that my office has had with this project, it has never been on time. When we go back to the audits of 1992, there was a plan that all of the renovation and rehabilitation work would be completed by 2013. Obviously, that's not going to happen. The budget at the time, I think, was around $1 billion. Given, of course, increase in costs and a number of other issues, the costs have gone up. And we mentioned in the report an estimate of $5 billion, but even that is very preliminary and dates back to, I think, 2005. So I would not, think that that would be a precise number either. And it's really only when they start the work and probably begin to do some of the, the exploratory initial work that they will be able to do more precise cost estimates. So personally, I would not be at all surprised if the cost estimates increase over the project. As anyone who's ever renovated a house probably knows, even if you have a good contingency, there are always a few surprises along the way.
How would you describe the management of the project for the West Block, and particularly for the North Tower?
We looked at very specific elements of project management. Were they considering the heritage aspect? Were they doing proper costing? A few elements like that. And we found that the department was using, good practices and generally accepted practices, and we had no recommendations as regard the specific issues that we looked at.
So you felt, I take it then, that adequate safeguards were in place to mitigate any risk to taxpayers, or did you?
Well, we didn't look at issues like contracting, or we looked at sort of the general framework of project management. We did not get into specifics, for example, as I mentioned in my opening statement, like contracting or issues like that.
Lots more questions, but I guess my time is up, Mr. Chair.
Actually, you have 45 seconds.
Okay, good. So looking at what happened on the North Tower, we saw LM Sauvé win the bid over other firms that seemed to be much more qualified, only to go bankrupt. I assume they would have posted a performance bond to protect the government's interest, and that's what the normal practice is, I understand, for public works contracts. But would you agree the work in the North Tower was mismanaged? And do you know if the performance bond was called in when LM Sauvé ran into its financial difficulties?
Chair, that's not an issue that we looked at in this audit.
Thank you, Mr. Regan. Madame Bourgeois.
Merci, Monsieur.
Ms. Bourgeois, thank you, Mr. Chair, Ms. Fraser, Mr. Ricard, welcome to the committee. As you know, the reports from the Auditor General are always greatly appreciated by this committee. Ms. Fraser, you indicate in your report that the decision-making processes and accountability processes were fragmented. What do you mean by that? Well, because there are a number of major stakeholders, including the two chambers of Parliament and the Department of Public Works, as well as a Treasury Board with regard to funding. There was a report in 2004 which was given to the Real Property Directorate at Public Works, presented to Mr. Tim McGrath at the time. In that report, it was stated that Public Works had a lot of difficulty to ensure the implementation of the work. That was a study that was requested by the Real Property branch in order to compare the level of professional technical resources and costs related to carrying out major engineering and architectural work, and in comparison with best practices in the field. In that report, it was also stated that in nearly all cases, service suppliers indicated that once someone is assigned to a project, that person remains within the private sector until a project is completed. And that is quite distinct from regular procedure at Public Works, which in a certain way is someone who, a long-term worker at Parliament who follows the renovations, and said that so many changes had occurred at Public Works, in terms of their leadership, that in terms of project management, we can't really rely on organizational memory at the department, and that creates a certain dysfunction with regard to quick implementation of a project management structure. As well, it strips the department of project knowledge and therefore impedes those projects. You say there's no consensus on the establishment of priorities. What do you mean by that? Once again, I think we gave an example of renovations and the temporary spaces that were to be built while the parliamentary offices were evacuated. And parliamentary partners wanted that all activities be held within the parliamentary precinct. Other spaces, of course, are situated on the other side of Wellington Street. And so there were different opinions as to how long and how the MPs should be working outside of the parliamentary precinct, and whether the costs involved in that were acceptable. And so those people would be relocated only a number of years or for a longer period of time. So there were a lot of questions in that regard. And all this to respond to parliamentarians' needs. But in the meantime, there are constraints imposed by the department and the government which create certain tension. Now those governmental policies, and if I'm correct, the heritage building policy that comes from the Treasury Board, in 2007 you produced a report stating that Treasury Board's policy makes it difficult to make informed choices and to set priorities with regard to conservation of heritage buildings. And this is something that you've restated in your current report, where you say that there are irritants that prevent people from moving forward. I say there's an even more basic divergence of opinion as to whether the parliamentary buildings are subject to governmental policy itself. And you ask that those policies be changed, and no changes have been made so far. I think that Parliament would say that it is not subject to government policies. Parliament can decide and establish its own rules according to its own requirements without regard to government rules. I think what's even worse is that you say that there's no long-term funding commitment, and in this year's report on page 17 and 18, you clearly demonstrate that even if parliamentarians have been consulted when projects are being drawn up, they are not part of the government's decisional process, and the government does not always approve funding to cover the estimated costs. You also say that stable funding would facilitate project implementation. So this is how I read this, Ms. Fraser. Currently, there's a power struggle. On the one hand, in my view, you have users and legislative partners. On the other side, you have Public Works and Treasury Board who hold the political power. So you have legislative power, which needs office space and services, and the political side. The political power, namely Public Works and Government Services, here you have the department that can award contracts, and therefore can, and there's a possibility of influence peddling. We know that there are cases when Public Works was brought before the tribunals because the contracting rules had not been properly followed. Now, that's an aside. Public Works apparently held consultations. However, requests from legislative partners are not found in those plans. And when you have 5-year plans, when you should actually have more comprehensive plans for the establishment of all the structures to facilitate the rehabilitation of buildings. we cannot forget that it is Public Works that calls on the Treasury Board to give it the funds needed to carry out the work. And Treasury Board has the financial power and does not allow an adequate financial commitment, which can open the door to influence peddling. And finally, Treasury Board knows full well that it is important that the partners and departments have the money to carry out this rehabilitation process. If I understand correctly, all stakeholders have known for a number of years that Public Works wasn't doing its work effectively in terms of decision making, and everyone knew that Treasury Board, its policy wasn't effective. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We're out of time on the question. If you wish, Madam Fraser.
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Gourde. Monsieur Gourde, pour 8 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Gourde, you have 8 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Madam Fraser for appearing, as well as to Mr. Ricard. You indicated, Ms. Fraser, in your report that the management of parliamentary precinct was quite sound, but your findings in your report show that there are certain deficiencies which lead to a number of conclusions. And what exactly challenges do you foresee for the parliamentary precinct? For the past number of years, we've noted a significant deterioration in the structure of parliamentary buildings. In the report, we've noted systems in the West Block, which are considered in a critical state and which might no longer be able to function. So there are systems that if they were no longer operational, that means Parliament can no longer do its work. So the situation is becoming increasingly critical, and there needs to be a proper rehabilitation, and work has to be carried out. To do that, of course, plans have to be in place. There's a 5-year plan, but there would also need to be a longer-term plan. I think it's okay to have these 5-year plans. However, there needs to be stable funding. We've seen over the years that there's been a lot of work stoppage because of a lack of stable funding. And there's also the issue of governance, problems that have been identified for over 20 years. Public Works is caught between a rock and a hard place, between parliamentarians who have their needs and the Treasury Board, which approves funding. And so Public Works is trying to respond to those differing needs. We believe that the responsibility over these buildings should rest with Parliament. Parliament should have more responsibility over the work done and funding, and should be accountable in terms of progress achieved. As part of the governance system, does Parliament have the required expertise to carry out follow-up? Well, of course, Parliament will have to come up with a mechanism, a credible and sound mechanism, to manage its buildings and projects. I presume that the services of Public Works would be called on for that work, but it's a question of governance to decide priorities, to ensure funding, and I say to negotiate the funding with the government, and to do proper monitoring. And so there should be a mechanism for which Parliament would be responsible to carry out the work. But those mechanisms must also be reviewed annually. Would you suggest another way of doing things? I think that has to be addressed. I believe there needs to be stable funding. Now, perhaps there could be a multi-year credit allocation for projects. This, we believe, is important for longer-term projects. If you always have to ask whether in the next 6 months you'll have the work needed to continue. That creates a lot of impact in terms of effectiveness and has an impact on the staff, and can also cause delays, as we have seen over the past 20 years. So I think there could be better mechanisms to ensure stable funding and to ensure that work is conducted without frequent interruptions. In your experience in working in other departments, have similar mechanisms been used, or will we have to reinvent a new system? Well, I think this is a specific case here. It's quite unique. We're talking about a mechanism that would be ensured by Parliament. Some options were studied in the past. The department indicated in response to our report that it would study the various options. In the report, we've noted examples of mechanisms that are used in other countries. But I think the case is quite unique, since we're talking about Parliament, and Parliament which has to have the responsibility. So we are going to have to reinvent certain benchmarks. Well, as I said, studies have been carried out in the past, and a number of options were studied by parliamentary partners and the government. And the government clearly indicated that it agreed to review those studies and those options. I would have thought, because they said that about a year ago, that the government is probably close to completing its review and has probably had discussions with parliamentary partners and is close to coming up with a recommended option. Of course, work has to be carried out, statutory changes to implement the chosen option. Thank you.
Time left on the Conservative watch. Got 2 minutes left.
2 minutes? Go ahead.
Ron?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Ms. Fraser. And our constituents of Kelowna Lake Country are looking forward to having you at the UBC Okanagan talk in a couple of weeks. I hope to have a chance to visit with you then as well. So thank you for being here today and for this very important discussion. I believe all of us around the table, it's not a partisan issue. This is a national historic icon. Parliament buildings. I can still remember the first time I brought my family here a little over a decade ago, and coming from, I said, it's one of those bucket list things. Every Canadian should have a chance to come and visit Parliament Hill, and makes you even prouder to be a Canadian. Just quickly, with my limited time, I know that you've had a great deal of research and extensive knowledge working with the Speaker and Ms. O'Brien. Just wondering if you had any other countries' governance models that you might be able to identify that would help our committee to look at as we continue the study and come up with something that would help for future parliamentarians as well.
Thank you very much for the question, Chair. In the report, we mentioned the models of 3 countries. I'm just trying to find it here. The U.S., Great Britain, and Australia. Each of them, in each of those cases, they have the responsibility for their parliament buildings rests with Parliament. There are different models that have been set up. In some cases, organizations that are directly within the Commons administration. In other places, there's the architect of the Capitol Hill in the U.S. But in all 3 models, the responsibility for the buildings rests with Parliament. It's interesting when we go back to the report that was issued in 1992, that was just the time that Great Britain had transferred the responsibility from a government department to Parliament, and one of the recommendations then was that the government here should be studying that and keeping track of how that model was working. I think we all agree that, any model is going to have some challenges with it, but certainly by looking at these 3 countries, and I believe that Public Works has or would have as part of their study looked at the various models elsewhere to see the advantages, disadvantages, and to determine what would be the most appropriate mechanism to put in place here in Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Cannon. Madame Cody, for
Thank
5
you.
minutes.
Thank you very much, and we certainly appreciate you being here today, and this is a very important topic. I was speaking with a constituent, and I think this is where Ron was going, and a constituent today, Joe, and we were talking about the fact that I was coming to committee today and talking about this important issue and how long the renovations have been going on at Parliament Hill and how much they cost. And I noted, and I mentioned to him, and Joe came back with me with a point that I'm going to raise now. He said, we were talking about how you talked about the increasing project costs and the risks involved. And Joe's point, as a Canadian, as a taxpayer, was, my goodness, why can't we get this right? I mean, this has been going on a tremendously long time and costing us a tremendous amount of money. Can you elaborate, perhaps, on the costs and the risks you see?
Well, the costs, Chair, in the report we note that there had been an estimate done in 2005 that the total cost of the project would be somewhere in the order of $5 billion. I think we have to all recognize that that was a very preliminary estimate done at the time. Costs have likely increased since then. There may have been as well different requirements that have been put in, either building requirements or security requirements that have been put in place since then. So I think it can kind of give us a bit of an idea of what the extent of costs will be, but as I said earlier, I would not at all be surprised if those costs will increase as the projects are undertaken, and as well as the actual state of the buildings is better understood.
That is one of the risks I would imagine.
It is a huge risk.
The functionality of the buildings, the function.
And as we note in the report, I mean, some of the buildings are deteriorating, and some of them are at a pretty serious stage. The West Block, the risk of failure of key building systems is rated now as critical. In the Center Block, by 2013, that risk is rated as high, and by 2019 is critical.
So I guess if we could sum up, one would be the costs escalating far above the $5 billion, the amount we have no idea really at this point. And the second risk is the functionality of our actual government, and our governance of our country is at risk based on what you've just said. So I read with interest from your report on page 7 where you talk about in 2005, and you just referenced that date, that Public Works and Government Services Canada and the parliamentary partners established a task force to review governance. 6 years ago, this would be now. In its report, A New Approach to Governance in the Parliamentary Precinct, they talked about the key flaws and made a recommendation for a new governance model. Now, this is 5+ years ago that this report came out. And we're today still talking about the poor management and how that governance model has to change because of the significant risks to both the dollar value as well as the operation of government. Could you talk to that, please? Could you speak to that?
The question of governance, as you mentioned, was studied about 5 or 6 years ago and a recommendation made. It was nothing has changed since then. But quite honestly, this is an issue that's at least 20 years old. There have been a number of reports, and I think it's really time, quite honestly, that the governance issue has to be addressed because the buildings, we can see that it is affecting the projects and the rehabilitation of the buildings. If you don't have clear priorities, if you don't get stable funding, and if you don't have plans that you can actually we're going to be back into 20 years again, and the buildings, quite frankly, are not going to last another 20 years.
I want to, that's one thing, the operations of government, and we recognize that as a risk. The other one, and I thought this was really interesting, I just recently had an order paper question answered, and I asked the question regarding the long-term vision plan for the renovations, and the question was around the contracts. And of the 27 contracts that I reviewed, 25 were over budget, and they were over budget by over $33 million. So when you look just on those particular, the section that I was looking at, those 27 contracts, 25 of the 27 were over budget by a significant amount of money. And when you talk about $5 billion, if you look at it, you know, all you have to do is surmise how much more dollar value this is going to cost us, and how significant this is to not only to our Treasury but also to our governance model. And so I think we do have to act very quickly on this.
Yes. Thank you. Do you wish to offer any observation on Ms. Cody's
Well,
comment?
I would just add, I mean, we didn't look at the contracts, and so I can't really talk to that, but I think it's important for the committee to realize that these are very complex projects that are being undertaken in heritage buildings. As I mentioned earlier, anyone who's ever done a renovation of an old house knows that when you open up the walls, you find sometimes things that you never expected to find. And what might interest the committee, I don't know if you have done it, is to actually go with Public Works to see some of the rehabilitation work going on and some of the challenges that they have in managing this. I was fortunate enough when we were doing the audit to visit the work that was being done in the west block on the tower, and it was actually very impressive to see the kind of care that they were taking, obviously, to the historic, but some of the challenges that they had to deal with as well in doing that work. So that might be a suggestion for the committee.
Thank you. Monsieur Lemay, pour 5 minutes.
You have 5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Auditor General. Mr. Ricard, I'm quite impressed when I read these documents. I went back to 1992 reports. I'd like to read a sentence. I don't know if you read Mr. McGraw's report, Executive Director of the Real Property Branch at Public Works and Government Services Canada. He says the following on page 37 out of 79. If we compare with other organizations, in each project, the duplication of assessment work leads to delays. And Public Works and Government Services explain that the reason for such a practice is that it allows for the state to ensure long-term savings by ensuring that the design is acceptable. Now, I read that and then I listen to you. Someone somewhere is getting this wrong, and I don't think you are wrong. Because you are saying exactly the opposite. That is to say that more people get involved, the more time it takes, and the more studies have to be restudied, and the more costs that go up. And that's my understanding of it. Well, the longer you wait to carry out work, the more the work will cost through increased cost and because the state of the buildings is deteriorating. What I want to understand is, and you have some nice graphs here in your report, but you refer to the West Block. In 2007, the situation was critical. In 2013, it would be a complete operational a breakdown or failure. The difference between critical, when I hear someone's in a critical situation, that person is not in a good state. Now, when I hear about complete operational failure, what's the difference between the two? Well, I imagine engineers would be better suited to answer that, but critical means that there's a significant risk that a system would cease functioning. And in 2013, clearly those systems won't function anymore. Now, that's for the West Block. Oh, that's okay, the building was closed. That's okay. Now, what I'm concerned of is the Center Block, in which we're sitting. In 2007, the situation was medium. In 2013, that's in less than 2 years, the situation will be high risk. Can you tell us what will happen? The Peace Tower will fall on our heads? What exactly does that mean? Well, I think we're referring to heating systems, electricity, ventilation system. These are basic systems. Without such systems, without these HVAC systems or electricity systems, there can be no operationals. I want to understand. Perhaps let's call it the Parliamentary Precinct Committee, to ensure that everyone is aware of this problem. There has to be such a committee. I don't know who could do the proper work. Do you still believe in public works? As we indicated in the report, once the priorities have been clearly established and an order has been sent out, public works does proper work. The problem is establishing priorities, coming up with decisions, and establishing a long-term plan and obtaining the required funding. The problem is, I'm a politician and I want to get re-elected. So I work, and as we see with programs, on a 1, 2, 3 year basis. And when you recommend that perhaps we should vote on credits for 5, 6 billion over 10 years, that's what you're recommending, no? Yes, I must say this is a problem that we've noted with other projects, not only with the rehabilitation of parliamentary buildings, but with all major informatics projects that have to be carried out over 3, 4, 5 years. To go back every year to obtain funding imperils a project. Staff is hired on a term basis, and you don't have stability to ensure proper work. Thank you, Mr. Lemay.
Oh, Mr. Callander.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I have to tell you, it's very good to have you here, and it's one of the big disappointments. I've been talking about this a lot since I was elected. I was elected in 2008, but one of the biggest disappointments I've had has been the condition of the buildings since I've been here. I make no secret of the fact that I never really wanted to be a police officer or a firefighter, although they're great occupations. I always wanted to be the Prime Minister of Canada since I can remember. And I was so proud to be sworn in right here in this room. But then to tour around the place and see how badly it had deteriorated left me somewhat upset that we had all allowed this to happen. And when we've been focusing on this committee so much on trying to find a hidden skeleton in someone's closet or something that we can pin on a government or something, the reality was that when we had the architects here, they had said that when we did our first building assessment back in 1995, we found certain problems. When we came back in 2003-04, we were quite surprised at the amount of deterioration that had happened since that time. The project was stopped in 1999 for a period, and we felt that during that time the deterioration was tremendous, and it's continuing. And as you said earlier today, you found that once Public Works has the commitment of parliamentarians, and we found that too in the investigations that we've had, they have done spectacular work. It's done properly, it's done ethically, the contracts are all top-notch. It's just a matter of getting the political will to get it done, even when we're in difficult circumstances. I noted, and you have a couple of models. I know in Ontario, the Speaker is in control of the renovations of the legislature. He's provided a budget, and in essence, since the mid-90s, the structure is every year just being repaired. There's no question of it. The scaffolding just makes its way around the building, and that's the end of it. But after many years, we finally started to take care of that building. But I want to just also quickly fold in official residences into this. Because it's not just the parliamentary precinct that are important. It's also, you know, the Prime Minister's home, the Leader of the Opposition's home, Rideau Hall, that structure as well. I think we've all failed miserably, no matter who's been in government in charge of public works. It's not a criticism of Public Works. They do spectacular work, but is there a way we can also fold in them and official residents into this?
Chair, I wish I brought it. We did an audit of the management of official residences in 2006-07, probably. I can certainly provide a copy to the committee if you're interested. They fall under the National Capital Commission and Public Works. We found that actually there had been a lot of improvement made in most of the official residences, with the exception of 24 Sussex. And 24 Sussex, again, is in need of serious repair. The difficulty there is the Prime Minister and his family will have to move out for over a year, and that has been the major, I think, one of the major factors that have delayed the work there. But again, the funding, and for those residences, the funding does appear to be in place. So there's a little more progress, I think, being made on that side, and then on the parliamentary precinct. But it certainly is something that could be looked at going forward. Yeah.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Madam Fraser and Mr. Ricard. Could I ask you then, please, through the chair, could I ask you to undertake to provide that audit of the official residences to the committee? I think that would be well received so that we can factor that into our considerations. Madam Fraser, you made a suggestion as well, which I think is a very good one, that this committee see what Public Works is doing and actually go take a look. You know, when I sat on the Board of Governors of the University of Western Ontario in London, and certainly the notion of building and renovating buildings was a very important part of our role. I can tell you that when you see some of the things firsthand, it increases your understanding. And I think for us, particularly as you're making some suggestions about what Parliament's role might be, the notion of having a sense of exactly what they do, I think Pat Martin might be the only one that's got really hands-on construction experience, although Mr. LeMay, I think he looks pretty handy. I am not. But the notion of being able to see what they do, I think, would be useful for all of us. So I hope that we would, as a committee, imagine that we could do that. I may have another round, so I'll be able to ask that. But again, thank you both for attending.
Okay, thank you. I have an image of Pat Martin in construction overalls fixing Parliament buildings, which probably we shouldn't go for. Thank you to my Liberal colleagues for an opportunity to ask you some questions. I agree with Mr. Cannon that it should be on every Canadian's bucket list to visit this place, although I don't relish the end of the bucket list because it's usually. This is unfortunately a bit of a whited sepulcher because it looks nice on the outside. On the inside, these buildings are pretty grim and they need something done. And essentially, as I see it, the governance structure is unfixable. There's just way too many fingers in the pie, and there needs to be a new governance structure. That responsibility falls to us, nobody else. And you mentioned an interesting point that the devil was in the details. The UK, Australia, the US all have a separate entity to take care of not only the governance structure but also the capital and operating functions. Could you offer the committee an opinion with respect to the limitations, the pros and the cons, if you will, of that form of separate modeling?
I think one of the major, well, first of all, I would think that if an organization like that was established, it would be an officer or agent of Parliament. With a head of that, there would have to be, questions around how the appointment process was made, the qualifications, how that office would be established, who they would report to, what would be the role of parliamentarians, what committee would that organization report to, what authorities would they have. And I think one of the big issues that has to be resolved is the whole question of funding. And how do you interface the funding requirements here with the fiscal framework of the government? And that, I think, has always been a bit of a tension between the priorities and the needs that the parliamentary partners would establish and the funds that the government has available to do these renovations. So that whole issue about how that would play out, I think, has to be given some serious consideration.
Why would you disaggregate the funding that currently Parliament receives, which is, I don't know, it's 300 or 400 million from? Why would you disaggregate that or make it more difficult if, in fact, the Parliament took on more responsibility for its own capital improvements? Why is that? Why would that be more complicated?
I would say just probably because of the amounts of money involved. And
So it's an issue of model, it's an issue of amount rather than an issue of model.
yes, it would be an issue of amount, and if this whatever body, intendant or whatever, decided they need $1 billion per year, will that work in the fiscal framework of the government?
But that money is being spent now, one way or another. The issue is that it's being spent inefficiently, or
Well, I wouldn't even say it's being. One of the
Okay,
problems
fair
was that it wasn't being spent,
yeah.
and the projects would be designed, but the funding was never given to do the projects. And I think that's one of the major reasons for delays through all those years was the funding was just not made available to be able to carry out the projects. So in approving a plan, be it a 5-year plan, the long-term funding should go with that. And so it's I guess the tension with government to say how much money comes out of the fiscal framework for these projects.
And Mr. Gourd made an interesting point about Parliament not really being set up to manage its own physical premises. On the other hand, there's no real reason why Parliament could not take on that as either a separate agency or take on that expertise as part of a parliamentary function.
That's right. It's done elsewhere.
Okay. Okay. Well, I run very hard on my colleagues about time, and so I'll run them myself. Colleagues, Mr. Martin has yet to have an opportunity, and I would propose, unless I see strenuous objection, giving Mr. Martin the last 5 minutes. Is that?
Where's his coveralls are?
Where's what? Yeah. Where's what? Yeah. Overseas. And I'll give Mr. Holder the last couple of minutes.
Thank you, Council. Thank you.
5 minutes for Mr. Martin, and the remaining time to Mr. Holder, and then we'll call it.
Thank you very much to you and to the committee. I apologize I had to be away for some of your presentation, Madam Fraser. Ms. Fraser, in your brief to us today, you point out quite rightly that the Parliament buildings are the centerpiece of our national political life. The site, the style, the building layout were designed to convey an image of ceremony and order. The difficulty is that we have is that the renovations now have become a metaphor for waste and indolence and even corruption. And it serves an element of incompetence, not due to the individuals involved, but perhaps that there's just too many chefs spoiling the soup. We in this committee have been studying the fact that the renovations of West Block have turned from a fiasco to a farce. And everything on Parliament Hill, I come from a construction background, I'm a carpenter by trade, everything on Parliament Hill costs 10 times as much and takes 10 times as long as building something in the real world. I mean, that building we had to cancel because of cost overruns, which would have solved all of our committee rooms. The cost was getting up to $350 million. We just built a full, huge 350-bed hospital in Winnipeg for $280 million, and office buildings don't cost as much as hospitals. So for some reason, things are completely out of whack here. So I appreciate and I agree with you that this long-standing government's problem has to be resolved. Just as an example for my colleagues here, I think a lot of Canadians would be shocked to learn that we're actually tenants in our own house here. We're not masters of our own house. We have to ask permission to do anything. I try to have the flag lowered when a Canadian soldier is killed overseas, and the reason that we couldn't wasn't because of any lack of political will. It was because we have no control over when the flag is raised and lowered. That's done by Public Works and Government Services, and therefore we have no say. I mean, it's time for a tenants' revolt, and we should take back direction and control of our Parliament buildings by Parliament, because the other guys have frankly messed it up to the point that it's an untenable situation. I know I've missed some of the questioning, and this question may have been asked, but from a best practices point of view, do you have any model internationally in other jurisdictions that you prefer over others?
Chair, I just briefly remark that we note in the report examples from England, Australia, and the U.S., where in all cases the responsibility and accountability for their legislative buildings have been given back to their legislature. There have been studies in the past of different models. Government certainly agreed with our recommendation that they come forward with an option. I would just add, too, at the time of discussing the recommendation, we did discuss it, of course, with government and with the parliamentary partners, and everyone seemed quite favorable to moving in that direction. So it's really now to decide upon the mechanism, the best mechanism to put in place, and to move forward to do that.
Could I ask, Mr. Chair, through you to the clerk to find out if we can? I understand that 4 globe-trotting senators went on a fact-finding mission on their own, unilaterally, I think without consultation of our committee, in February of 2010. And they went to these jurisdictions to study the governance of those parliaments. I wish they had consulted us, because I think we would have great interest in their findings. But could we find out the report that our globe-trotting friends may have written in conclusion, in their lucid moments? Maybe they've made some notes, and we would benefit from those notes.
Yeah. Do you have specific? Well, after the meeting, you can be a bit more specific as to who these folks might be.
Well, I believe it was in February of 2010, 4 senators visited other jurisdictions to investigate how guardianship of Westminster and other capitals was undertaken now, and to help assess the viability of such a program in Ottawa. So clearly they had the same thing in mind when they took off to investigate this, and I think we would benefit, our study would benefit. I wonder if the clerk could ask for the cooperation of the Senate to share those documents with us. It may be useful.
Okay. Is that fine? I have a couple minutes left in the hour here. I did say to Mr. Holder that I would give him a couple of minutes to finish his line of questioning.
Thank you very much. When we undertook to review the whole issue of the parliamentary precinct, Madam Fraser, I think one of the things that we all talked about was that this was an opportunity for this committee to effectively establish a legacy. There were some things that we could do that would be meaningful for this place. That's something that would live beyond all of us. Hopefully not take as long as until after we die, but certainly that we could set the framework for it. I think it's really clear that what we all agreed we would do is this isn't an issue of trying to find blame. This isn't an issue of trying to come together for the right reason. And I think part of that is trying to find that balance between what I would call care and cost. It's always the kind of thing that we try to look at. So what I'm trying to, it seems to me that when you raise the 3 considerations, accountability, relationships, long-term plans to rehabilitate the buildings, and stable and long-term funding, it struck me that the stable and long-term funding piece was probably the glue that makes this work. Is there a way from a funding standpoint? I mean, I would imagine that any government of the day, because this problem isn't today, didn't just occur this last year or 5 years or 10 or 15 years. It's been something where, frankly, it's critical that we tackle it. From your perspective, is there a way that we could, acknowledging that we want to balance budgets or work towards that as we go forward, and the Canadian people are asking us to do that, how do we fix that with the notion that these are considerable expenses that need to be undertaken to make this place work? How would you imagine from a budgeting standpoint that could work, please?
Chair, we've called, and I will continue to call before the end of my mandate. I think there needs to be longer fiscal projections. We see the Parliament buildings, but there's also a number of other challenges facing government, fiscal pressures that are going to come. Almost every review that we do of Crown corporations points to funding rusting infrastructure. Be it the ferries to Newfoundland, the postal modernization. When we talk about IT systems in government, I mean, there's going to be needs there. So there has to be a really clear, I think, portrait drawn of what are all these requirements that are going to be coming over the next few years. How is government planning to deal with that? in addition to an aging population and climate change, which are both going to put pressure on the fiscal situation. So longer term, I think longer term projections, engage in a dialogue with Canadians about how is government going to pay for all of this. And then on the mechanics of all this, this committee in the past actually undertook a study of accrual appropriations. Certain members will recall that, and actually made a recommendation concerning multi-year appropriations. And I really think that that's the way to go, that on some of these very large projects that are going to span over several years, there needs to be more assurance of the funding. It doesn't mean that, of course, a subsequent government can't or Parliament can't come in and then, stop it. But there needs to be more stability in funding. So the committee might wish to go back and actually look at some of the really good work that was done on the whole question of accrual appropriations, multi-year funding. That would have been about 4 years ago, probably, that it was done. So I think there needs to be a change in the way we look at some of the challenges that are coming and the way that these projects are funded.
Thank you, Mr. Holder, and on behalf of the committee, I want to thank Madam Fraser, and as always, thoughtful and well-researched, and we appreciate your contributions to this discussion. I'm going to suspend for a couple of minutes while we go in camera. Thanks again.